welcome, Minister, and staff here. And obviously, I welcome the statement, Minister, in relation to where we're at. And obviously, we've come through the last 18 months a pretty kind of a bad time in relation to our well-being, and it's been very, very difficult for most people, and some of that has been very invisible in some guises, and some of them issues have been compounded by the pandemic. But there is kind of light at the end of the tunnel, and the light at the end of the tunnel is that we're coming out of this pandemic, and there is legacy issues in relation to that. So that's the kind of number of the questions that I'm going to ask today. Just the first question, and this is an issue that has been raised numerous times, is in relation to CAMHS waiting lists. How are age-appropriate staff being recruited, trained and retained at this particular time? Because as kind of public representatives, it's one of the issue that kind of raises its head all the time in relation to access to CAMHS and children that need this service intervention very, very quickly. So how is that kind of being addressed at this moment of time?
Thanks, Deputy, for your question, and thank you as well. Anytime you question me in the Dáil, you always take a constructive approach, as do all your colleagues in relation to mental health. So I suppose I was concerned, obviously, about the waiting list as well for CAMHS, and as you said, some of them are hereditary, they're there with a while. But what I did was I took an approach there earlier in the year, which I don't think a previous minister had done. So I met with the chief officer of each CHO in relation to mental health. So we held 9 meetings within a week, and we did 3 a day. And I met directly with, as I said, the chief officer to hear from them what it's like on the ground. Where are they seeing the challenges in relation to staffing issues? Why are some areas performing much better in relation to waiting lists for CAMHS? For example, they do really well in the Galway particular area. Their waiting list would always be very good. They would have had issues, for example, in long waiting lists, for example, in CHO4, which is Cork and Kerry. And I'm delighted to say that when Michael Fitzgerald took over there as the chief officer, what he did was he put in he hired extra capacity, and he took down the waiting list by a third very, very quickly. So there's innovative things you can do. Now, to answer your question directly in relation to recruitment, so my budget for this year, so there was an extra 23 million for new developments, which equates to 153 extra staff. So 29 staff were specifically for CAMHS, to support the telehub sections of CAMHS and also the different teams. Out of the 153 staff to date, 40 have been recruited in total. Now, as you know, as I said earlier, recruitment within the HSE is a slower process. It can take up to 50 weeks. So I do expect a lot of those posts to be filled at the end of Q3 and Q4. We will have a lot more in place by the end of the year. You're right in relation to what you said. Sometimes you can recruit staff, and they mightn't be, they might have dealt with adults for mental health as against dealing specifically with children, and obviously they would have to upskill in relation to that. Philip, will I just let you in, because Dr. Philip Dodd is a psychiatrist himself, so he would have a lot of information in relation to this.
Yeah, well, I guess the essence of an effective specialist mental health service is to ensure that there's rapid access at primary care level as well. So the initiatives and innovations that have taken place in the development of primary care psychology ensures as best as possible that children and young people that require supports that would be less specialist in requirement that they're provided with. So I think the development of a comprehensive mental health support system for children really requires primary care investment as well as specialist mental health care investment. And I think the additional investment in primary care psychology to deal with the historic waitlist will hopefully also add to the potential reduction in CAMHS waitlist as well.
Can I say one other thing, Deputy, as well? There is greater flexibility in the CAMHS team's skill mix under sharing the vision that was there previously for a vision for change. A Vision for Change was more a prescriptive model. So this will create opportunities for more focused care levels at local level. It's not as prescriptive, and it's putting the patient, the service user, front and centre.
Thanks. In relation to the question of specialists in relation to therapy, I know there has been an issue in relation to recruitment and retention. Is that issue ongoing in relation to retaining specialists in this field? Because if you obviously have a situation where you can't retain staff for all sorts of reasons, you're always going to be chasing your tail in relation to this field. So where are we at in relation to retention of specialists in the CAM service?
So I suppose, look, obviously, we provide the budget and the HSE are in charge of doing the recruitment and, working closely, as I said earlier, with Dr. Niazi, who looks after the recruitment in relation to his team, look after the recruitment in relation to the clinical programmes, and they've been working very, very hard to recruit. I suppose the situation in relation to recruitment, it's more or less, I suppose the HSE would answer this probably more succinct for you, but I suppose there has been challenges in relation to recruitment and retention for far many years. I suppose where I'm frustrated is the length of time it takes to recruit a person into post, and the fact that they may not be able to be released quickly if their own post has to be backfilled. That can cause challenges. Like, we recently filled a psychology post in Wexford, and it had gone on for quite a long time, almost 18 months, and we were lucky to get a psychologist in place there. So it is frustrating for local areas if they're without, I suppose a person who's going to be the team leader, who, the psychiatrist, the psychologist. It can be very difficult, to recruit into specific areas. But certainly that particular recruitment post was escalated the whole way up the HSE to have that person in place. And I'm delighted to say they are now in place.
Just another question, kind of slightly related to that, is in relation to specialists being recruited for around eating disorders.
Yeah.
And we've seen kind of manifestation in relation to a major increase of young people presenting themselves with an eating disorder. And I think that has been compounded by the last 18 months. So in relation to that, what have the HSE done in relation to recruiting specialists in the field of eating disorders?
Okay, so thank you for your question. I suppose, the team around me here will know that I've been talking about eating disorders for the last 14 months, because it has, as you quite rightly say, it has manifested, especially last year and this year in relation to the pandemic. I think, and I'm open to correction, but close to 487 young people were admitted last year with an eating disorder, especially young teenagers. So it's a very worrying trend we're seeing at the moment. The National Clinical Programme for Eating Disorders was launched in 2018, but unfortunately in 2019 and 2020 the funding wasn't available. So I reinstated the funding this year, so 3.94 million has been reinstated this year. So when I came into post, we had 3 eating disorder teams. Now the clinical programme, when it was set out in 2018, wants a total of 16 teams to cover the whole country. So when I came into post, we had 3 teams that weren't fully populated. So what has happened this year as a result of the funding, the 3.94 million, we will have 3 teams fully populated, and we will have 3 new teams in place by the end of this year. I'm already looking at next year in relation to the budget's estimate, and what I want to see is another further 3 teams next year. Again, we'll come back to the recruitment. It can be quite challenging to get the people into place. And an eating disorder team, people will really benefit with community-based eating disorder teams, and people can recover from an eating disorder. And I suppose that's one of the things I'd like to say today. But just to let you know, so funding has been made available, as I said, this year, to progress the recruitment of an additional CAMS-based eating disorder team in CHO2, and the creation of 2 new adult eating disorder hubs in CHO4 and CHO9. So by the end of this year, we will have 3 adult and we'll have 3 CAMS teams in place, and we'll be rolling out, as I said, I had a meeting last week in relation to next year's estimates. The most important thing about a clinical programme, for it to succeed, you need to build on it every single year, and you need to get the rollout continuing. Again, we have challenges because the team, you know, there's a lot of people, a lot of disciplines within the eating disorder team, dietitians, occupational therapists, the whole way down, you know. But as I said, it's a real positive. It's a real positive story. But at the same time, I would be very concerned about the amount of people presenting with eating disorders. And the clinical programme is being led really well at the moment. And also, they would have the support of Bodywise. A lot of people would know about that organisation, that NGO that support people with eating disorders also.
This question for Dr. Dodd in relation to his observations in relation to eating disorders. Obviously, as Mr. Butler said, 487% of themselves are in, you know, we're getting care or getting treatment in relation to eating disorders. Like compared to, say, prior to 18 months ago or 2 years ago, what was the kind of the numbers like in relation to, you know, this condition? Because it seems to be, as I said, was compounded, and it probably still is compounded by the kind of the flows of the pandemic.
Thank you, Deputy. I can't actually honestly say with regard to numbers prior to 2019, 2020, because the National Clinical Programme wasn't sufficiently in place to gather that level of diagnostic specific data. But what I do know is that obviously, and I think Minister Butler has already addressed this point, the level of acuity and the numbers of individuals presenting with eating disorder type distress has obviously increased significantly. And with regard to, I guess, future planning, I know Minister Butler met with Dr. Amir Niazi and Dr. Michelle Clifford, the National Clinical Lead for Eating Disorders, and with specifically discussing the future response to the demand for eating disorder services. I know that the HSE is planning for 2022 to utilise any additional resource in a way that will respond in a broader geographical dispersed way, so that it won't simply be allied around the specialist teams. There will be provision provided in a broader setting in order to respond to the full population as best as possible.
And Deputy Kenny, if I could just say, the recruitment for the is on target for all of those to be in post by the end of this year. We're very close. So I just want to thank Dr. Amir Niazi and all his team for the work they have done in this. They've done phenomenal work to recruit in a very difficult time, coupled with COVID and the cyber attack. So, you know, it's one thing, you know, it's one area that I am really concerned about, the growth in young people, you know, where eating disorders and self-harm is a huge issue as well. And it's something that we are very conscious of. And it seems to be, you know, at times I think as well, what doesn't help, and I know you've spoken about this yourself in relation to social media and the pressures that it puts on young people, and, you know, body conscious and body image, that all drives this as well.
Just my final question.
Sorry, Gina, we've lost your sound.
Right, maybe?
Barely. You're gone on us? Yeah.
Yeah, just the final question. Just, Minister, this is a question for you. I'm not sure you can answer it, but I'll throw it your way. It's just in relation to the mental health budget. Yeah. And obviously, for Vision for Change and Shared in the Vision, and even Sláinte Care says mental health care in relation to the overall budget, it should be near 10%. Now, at the moment in Ireland, it's half that. It's 5.1. So, and even in Britain, it's 13%, and other countries, they spend up to 12%, 14% of the mental health budget on their overall health budget. But in Ireland, we're kind of quite behind. So in the lifetime of this government, how will they address that in relation to the overall spend on mental health care? Because obviously, if we double that in the next 3.5 years, the outcomes will be much better for everybody. But what's the commitment of this government in the lifetime of this government to address the issue of a legacy issue, historical legacy issue in relation to mental health spend. Now, I understand money has been, has been put towards mental health care. We understand that, but it's not near enough, and obviously that has a knock-on effects in relation to access to mental health care.
Thank you, Deputy. And just to say, because you mentioned the budget in the UK, it was interesting. I met with a colleague in Northern Ireland last week. So she's the mental health champion, because I was surprised to learn that there is actually no Minister for Mental Health in Northern Ireland. And a mental health champion was appointed. And I suppose part of the Shared Island initiative that we would collaborate with North-South. I met with her last week, and actually she was concerned about her budget, the budget that was available to her going forward. In relation to our budget, so the biggest ever budget in the history of the state was last year, so 1.14 billion. I suppose when you compare it to 2012, it was 711 million. And I suppose this is something I hear a lot of. So, right, the mental health budget is 5.1% of the health budget. But you must take into account that there was an extra 4 billion put into the health budget last year to deal with COVID. So it skewed it skewed the figures, I would think. The previous year, the budget was 6.3%. And I think the figure is misleading because of the significant extra funding to health services for infection control measures that wouldn't be included in it. In addition, the percentage represents only HSE funding for specialist mental health services. It doesn't capture funding for other parts of the health service that provide mental health services and supports, such as psychotropic medicines funded by the primary care service, liaison mental health service in acute hospitals, some dual diagnosis services and mental health and well-being promotion are funded under the addiction side of the budget. So I suppose, you can look at it in the round and see, sometimes you can have a person who has ill mental health who will be in the acute bed, and it mightn't be in a department of psychiatry. So it's very, very hard to differentiate. I do take on board the point you are making, and of course I'll be pushing really hard in this year's estimates to get the biggest budget we've ever had for mental health spending. Thank you very much.